I did a quick Google search and discovered that the koi fish living for 226 years is true. It's weird, but true. Will you pray with me? Spirit of the living God, fall fresh on all of us. Open our ears and our hearts and our minds to the revelation of your good news, today and every day. Amen. The blessed Sunday after Easter, the most glorious day in all the church calendar. Obviously, that's sarcasm, as this Sunday feels a bit like a hangover, doesn't it? A bit anticlimactic. Last week, we celebrated with trumpets, a literal trumpet, with songs about Christ being risen. So how do we even come close to that this week? The temptation for everyone, for all of us, is to go back to life as usual, leaving the drama and the magic of Easter behind. Even Jesus' own disciples seem to have returned to their old fears and routines. Our gospel reading for today from John picks up right after the resurrection, after Mary and the women testify to the good news that Christ had risen. Despite this testimony, most of the disciples harbored serious doubts about their rabbi's resurrection. And really, can you blame them? I mean, think about it. Someone rising from the dead, an empty tomb. In John's version of events, after the women found the tomb empty, they saw Jesus nearby, but confused him for the gardener. It wasn't until he spoke Mary's name that she then recognized him. And all that leaves us to wonder, how does that make any sense? It sounds as bizarre to us today as it likely did to Jesus' disciples in antiquity. A few years ago, in the height of the pandemic, when we worshiped together online and not here in this space, Amy and Kirk Freely were watching Easter worship together with their eldest child, Jesse, who was, if you know Jesse, an adult who was home during the pandemic time. And Jesse, sitting there watching Easter service that Sunday, was finding the whole resurrection story a bit hard to believe. She remarked that she just didn't get, among many things, why Mary wouldn't recognize Jesus. They were best friends, or even more. And her mom, Amy, suggested that maybe Mary didn't recognize Jesus because she wasn't expecting him there. And therefore, because of the difficulty of the context of the moment, she didn't recognize him. Well, that explanation did not satisfy Jesse. And Jesse said, "What? Mom, that makes absolutely zero sense. I mean, think about it. If you died, and I go to your grave and I'm putting flowers on your grave, and you sneak up behind me and you're just like, hey, do you think that I wouldn't recognize you? Do you think I'd be like, oh no, even though you look exactly like my mom, you surely are not my mom, and you're just probably some, I don't know, gardener?" Well, Jessie was pretty sure she had just won that argument. And so she grabbed her coffee and took a triumphant sip, giving Amy a second to think of a retort, to which she replied, "I don't know, Jessie. Maybe Jesus was wearing a hat." Listen, I get it. It is a completely implausible story. It doesn't make any natural sense. So it's no surprise that the disciples were stunned into silence when suddenly their teacher and their friend showed up in the midst of them. Just out of the blue. There was Jesus standing in the room with them while the doors remained locked. It was Jesus who spoke first, breaking the tension in the room, saying to them, "Peace be with you." At first, there must have been trepidation for the disciples, even as Jesus spoke to them. The scriptures tell us that Jesus showed them his wounds, his proof of identity, if you will. And only then did the room erupt with rejoicing. They celebrated the resurrection together in the same room where they had shared the Passover meal only a few days before. But not all of the disciples were in that room to see Jesus. According to the writer of John, Thomas was missing that day. And later, when the friends delivered the news of Jesus' visit, Thomas dismissed them. Maybe they had hallucinated the same thing. Maybe they'd all gotten a hold of the same bad mushrooms. "Unless I see him myself and touch his wounded hands and side, I won't believe," Thomas said. And who among us can blame him? Thomas gets a bad rap with that nickname of his. You know the one I'm talking about. Doubting Thomas. He surely cannot be faulted for wanting to see with his own eyes and experience the same thing that his friends experienced, and that is the risen Lord. Now, Jesus could have been like, "Well, tough luck, Thomas. You missed the big reveal. So you're just going to have to trust in the testimony of the others." I mean, once the news is out there, it's hard to recapture the energy and enthusiasm of that initial big moment, isn't it? For example, there's only one time you can hear the line, "I see dead people," from The Sixth Sense, and be sent absolutely reeling, like Bruce Willis's character in that movie. And that's no spoiler, because the movie's like 30 years old or something now. Jesus could have qualified his initial appearance to his disciples in that locked upper room as one of those "you had to be there" moments. But he didn't. He was willing to return to the same place, in the same way, just to meet Thomas where he was. As the story goes, a week later, the disciples, this time with Thomas, were locked in that upper room, and again, Jesus showed up. The resurrected Christ, the one who had defeated death and the grave, reenacted for Thomas what had happened before. And on that second occasion, Jesus came directly to Thomas and said, "I'm here for you, Thomas. I'm here to show you the wounds in my hands and my side, so that you might believe in me." Now, for many of us, Thomas is a kindred spirit. He is the realist that I and maybe you pride ourselves on being. Belief and faith in resurrection requires us to suspend what we know to be true and accept that there is some wisdom beyond our own understanding. Thomas is known to us because Thomas is us. Full of doubts, full of questions, full of wonderings, full of prove it to me's. Full of not until I see it with my own eyes will I believe it. Full of it can't possibly be true until I experience it firsthand. And guess what? The resurrected Christ will reenact whatever needs to be reenacted to meet you right in the midst of all of those doubts and frustrations and worries and wonders, all of those places where the doors are locked, just like the resurrected Christ did for Thomas. In my mind, What is so unbelievable about this story is not the risen Christ who was once dead but then is now alive suddenly appearing in a room with locked doors. That's like a Tuesday for Jesus. In my mind, what is so unbelievable, what is so unremarkable about this story is the absolutely lovely detail that Christ did it a second time for one person who didn't know if it was true or not. That the resurrected Christ in all of their glory could have ascended into the heavens, could have been gone from this earth and said, no, this matters too much to Thomas, so I must be present. That is unbelievable. When my 12-year-old son was a little bit younger, 8 or 9 years old, when he would get angry with me about some rule or consequence, he would storm up to his room and close the door as hard as he could. But he never got the satisfaction of locking the door because the bedroom door does not have a lock. And so what he would do instead would take everything in his room and pile it up against the door. Toys, books, one time a lamp, just anything loose in his room. He would put up against that door so that if I wanted to enter that room, I would have to push really hard just to get the door open, to get access to him. That was Thomas in that locked room. And friends, that's us, piling all the questions and objections and worries and wonders in our spirit, in our heart, up against the door so that Jesus cannot enter. So that God's love cannot find us there. This way of showing up isn't just the divine presence arriving without engagement. The unbelievable nature of what happened in that breached space where Jesus came into the room where the doors were still locked is that Jesus invites us in the same way he did Thomas to also experience the wounds he bears. Not necessarily to push away our doubts, but to meet us in them. To show up to us in them, to unite with the risen Christ, so that the miracle of Easter continues to be realized in us. Resurrection arrives in mysterious and varied ways. And throughout, God's presence is the one constant. Have your doubts and fears and worries caused you to lock some doors in your spirit, to hide away? That's okay. Because the risen Christ is prepared to meet you in the midst of those doubts. God will show up to you right where you are, exactly how you are, to proclaim that you too are invited to experience resurrection. To throw open locked doors of your soul and your spirit, even in the midst of your doubt. That is the gift of Easter. If we leave Easter to last Sunday, we will have missed it completely. We will have missed that it continues on day after day and week after week. And friends, that